Welcome to Windows on the World, another fascinating show for you tonight. And the recent shows we've put out, including the live streams, I will probably put onto Spreaker at some point, but we have been putting so much stuff out lately that there is a bit of a backlog, but all of it ends up on our Odyssey channel. And of course, all of our Sunday shows are in the Spreaker archive on the live shows page at windowsontheworld.net. So everything you need to know about the shows and all of the material which we've ever put out on the website is all available on the homepage. We have a Discord server that's linked there, Mark Windows Discord server, and also you can subscribe to us on Odyssey on Spreaker right there on the homepage. This show is going to be something a bit different and something I've been contemplating and thinking about for quite a long time, and I was looking for a useful angle for it. Yes, UFOs, the alien agenda. Well, we've talked about imposters, parasites and infiltrators in recent shows, so why don't we have a look tonight at the overlords of the UFO? I'm going to be reading from a few different sources, and I'm going to give you some information which I've gleaned over the years because I have been in contact with people who believe they've been abducted by aliens, and also people who are what they call witnesses and people who have had experiences. Some of these I think are complete fantasy, some are mixed up, and some are quite anomalous. So we're going to go into some of that, but we're going to look at this very objectively. I'm going to read now from a paper by Chris D. Barder, which came out in 1995, and it's called the UFO Contact Movement. This is just the introduction, and they're talking about how the alien agenda and UFOs has been advanced from 1950s, which is when it really started. Actually, it was the Roswell incident in 1947 that kicked all this off in a kind of industrial way. And this article was originally published in Studies in Popular Culture, Volume 17, Issue 2, as far back as 1995. And it says, in recent years, claims of UFO abduction and or contact have become an increasing fixture in the mass media. So-called reality television shows, such as NBC's Unsolved Mysteries, and the syndicated news magazines, such as Hard Copy and A Current Affair, regularly feature UFO accounts. And this, of course, has increased since then. The syndicated sightings and Fox's encounters are entirely devoted to UFOs and other paranormal phenomenon, while a popular new adventure series, The X-Files, remember that, utilises current UFO beliefs in its storylines. Well, that was the big one, wasn't it? But the market, as we say, the market for all this is absolutely flooded now, isn't it? There is so much of it about. And in a post-truth world, of course, we actually facilitate people who are pushing stories and fantasies. Everything's become what people feel now. Reality is about what people subjectively experience. Abductees, it says here, people who claim to have been kidnapped by alien beings, have appeared on talk shows such as Oprah Winfrey, Montel Williams, Maury Povich, Phil Donahue, Sally Jessy Raphael, Jenny Jones and Larry King Live. In October 1994, Larry King debuted a 2-hour special on UFO abductions and government cover-ups. UFO Cover-Up Live from Area 51 was one of these shows. In 1993, a movie about the supposed UFO abduction of Arizona logger Travis Walton, Fire in the Sky, became a modest hit. Now, the amount of distraction over places like Area 51 never yields anything new. And I think anybody who has a subscription to satellite cable TV will have sat through endless hours of people waffling, stood in a desert with that familiar fence behind them. And the attention given to claims of UFO contact, it says here, would only increase with the publication of Abduction by John E. Mack, a Harvard-educated psychiatrist, no less. Mack has become convinced of the reality of alien abductions. I've actually got that book. I inherited a whole library of this stuff ages ago. But in 1993, John Mack founded the Extraordinary Experience Research Center, a project of psychology and social change affiliated with Harvard Medical School. Now, I think the alien agenda is being used to advance the goals of the globalists? Well, of course, everything would be, wouldn't it? But when we look at the involvement of psychiatrists and these people who seem to have had beliefs implanted, we start to see something which is quite sinister at its core. And that's what we're going to be getting into this evening. But we've had Art Bell, Stephen Greer, Philip Klass. The amount of books and waffle put out by these people is endless, as there is no one to counter the claims and stories which flood out. The so-called skeptics, though, are often worse than the perpetrators. The whistleblowers on alien technology, what's that fella's name? Bob Lazar. I mean, these people gain huge audiences and are obviously supported. A lot of them are absolutely supported by the mainstream because, of course, it's a distraction. The UK groups are also very carefully controlled by key players. This is something I learned years ago from someone who was very involved in the UFO scene in the 90s and 2000s. And there were strategic gatekeepers. So that is not something new where we have all of our favoured groups led by gatekeepers. That has been going a long time. And interestingly, it's a big part of the UFO circuit as well. So that's interesting, isn't it? So why would they put these gatekeepers into such a subject as UFOs? Researchers of popular culture, this paper goes on to say, should be especially interested in the UFO contact movement because of its close ties to the science fiction genre. When the popular impression of UFOs changed from German or Japanese secret weapons to vehicles from another planet, the public's fears changed as well. Some feared that UFOs would stage an invasion of Earth. Such fears resembled back to Orson Welles' infamous 1938 broadcast of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, for example, which caused a panic when thousands of listeners became convinced that the show was chronicling real events. In the 1950s, UFO invasion films such as Earth versus the Flying Saucers and Invasion of the Saucermen were very popular. Since then, the bombardment has continued relentlessly. The UFO field is covered in a blanket of misinformation with a cloak of secrecy at its core. This is what I have gleaned after years of looking at it, and also from the people who are within this so-called area of research, which is in fact, in a way, a movement. I recently inherited a whole load of books on the subject, all the major stuff that is talked about, and it didn't really tell me anything I didn't know or think of already. And it has turned into a huge market for selling a story which may have an interesting basis to something, well, otherworldly. And there is also a global network, of course, of government debunkers and misinformation out there. And that, I think, is one of the key interesting points about the whole agenda, because that's what it is. It is an agenda. The official spokespersons for this just lead the public on and divert attention away from what is, of course, and must remain out of bounds. Of course, then there are I have it on very good authority from someone in the military. These types are all, without exception, wafflers, distraction, and utter time wasters. The gatekeeping distraction is also known as disclosure. Of course, nothing of any importance is ever disclosed. The Roswell incident in 1947 in New Mexico fed the agenda for the popularization of the alien agenda, and although many, including myself, have observed these lights moving around in formation, appearing, reappearing, and beguiling us, the only lasting memory is, what are they? Their mystery is in fact what makes them most compelling. And the last one I saw was actually in Greece. I filmed it, and this orange light was moving and darting around and hovering in and out of visible light. And when I looked back at it on my camera footage, it actually came out blue. So the light was orange, but it came out blue. And this thing was there for ages. I was actually on a Skype call to Jerry Marzinski. I said, Jerry, I'm looking at a UFO. He goes, what? And we talked about it. And I was on the phone to Jerry for about half an hour and it was still there. And then I went up to the mountains to see if I could track it. But it was actually a lot further away than it appeared to be. And there was a lot of military bases around this particular part of Greece. So that was quite interesting too. And I actually saw a whole formation of these UFOs when I was in North East London. In fact, I saw a lot in North East London in Walthamstow. I would see them above where Chingford is, where the reservoirs are. And also, I was actually outside a mini Tesco's with a garage on Leabridge Road one day, and there was one hovering in and out for ages. It was white and it was appearing and reappearing, darting around in a most bizarre manner. And there was also a helicopter up there. I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but all of this, of course, adds to the mystery because we never get to the bottom of what it's about. And apparently in northeast London, these UFOs are quite common there, and investigators cite the reservoirs as being an attraction to these lights in the sky. On the numerous sightings I have had, though, there is an impression of being observed while looking at them. That is really interesting. There's something very mysterious about it, because when I've seen them, and I've seen them in different countries, I've seen them quite often. I mean, I saw one in Central Eastern Europe about a year ago at a friend's restaurant. We sat out watching it for about an hour. It didn't go. And then eventually, of course, they just fade away and nobody is any the wiser. Apart from, of course, people who say they've been abducted, and we're going to get onto those later. But no one actually knows, so an industry grew up around it. The 50s book by George Adamski, Flying Saucers Are Real, featured photographs of the now archetypal flying saucer. This went on to become massive, of course, and was useful during the Cold War as propaganda. Today the subject is still used to distract and mislead the public. The idea of a fake alien invasion is often cited, Project Bluebeam and all that stuff, but an invisible and non-existent plague would be, and of course indeed has been, a lot more effective. The UFO was the focus of scores of sci-fi movies during the 50s. That's when it really took off. They ranged from B-movies from prolific filmmakers like Roger Corman and his Not of This Earth, which came out in 1957, to lots and lots of movies. I'm going to list some of them in a while because there were so many. But the storyline from Corman's Not of This Earth is quite typical of the perceived alien threat and concerns the attempts by an extraterrestrial of taking the blood of humans and to test it on himself as a treatment for a fatal blood disorder which is ravaging the population of his home planet Nirvana. Of course, we also had things like Plan 9 from Outer Space by Ed Wood. And an interesting one I found, which I read the book about 15 years ago, is The Man Who Fell to Earth by Walter Tevis. And this was made into a film with David Bowie, directed by Nick Rogue in 1976, which I don't think really did the story justice. Nick Rogue really deviated from the story, and although Bowie really looked like an alien in it, it was a pretty terrible film when you read the book, which was actually very compelling. And the story is that the alien becomes trapped in the earthly distractions of alcohol. After patenting his knowledge of technology, he sets up all these corporations and becomes massively wealthy. He's trapped and he's unable to create this spaceship to bring the people of his waterless planet to Earth. And he's investigated as a possible alien, and because of the sensitivity of his eyes, he has to wear these contact lenses. He gets blinded by X-rays, and that's after he's examined as a possible alien. And basically they say, well, he looks pretty human, there's something different about him, but he ends up at a loss, very lonely and drowning his sorrows. It's a very, very interesting story. And that film, The Man Who Fell to Earth, has been remade recently. Actually, I think it was about what was it actually? No, it was 2021, I think, or 2022 it came out. Just check it out anyway. But then we've got H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, The Day the Earth Stood Still, A Thing from Another World, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, It Came from Outer Space, Forbidden Planet, This Island Earth, Invaders from Mars, The War of the Worlds, I Married a Monster from Outer Space, Earth versus the Flying Saucers, 20 Million Miles to Earth. All these were in the 50s, these films. They captured the minds of the public into the possibility of invasion by aliens, which is, of course, a really good distraction principle. Useful stories about an invading force operating with governments under a controlling body is essential propaganda for what's going on now for the global governance structure under the UN, which unites all nations against a common enemy. Uniting against a common enemy is the main use of the alien threat. to bring us all together under global governance for the greater good of defending the Earth. This has been the goal of US and UK governments for a long time. The latest and biggest enemy, of course, is humanity itself, a threat to the very planet which hosts us. This agenda of a hostile force masquerading as a benevolent brotherhood was the subject of the 80s miniseries and film V, which had a brilliant plot. The UN being the global governance system uniting the nations in collaboration with the visitors who had appeared in massive spaceships over every city in the world. And they appeared human, but were in fact reptilian beings who wanted to eat the world's population by freezing them and also removing the resources of the earth, mainly the water. This was, of course, a precursor to Agenda 21 and 2030 and fits very well. And it also begs the question as to whether there is an off-planetary influence to Agenda 2030, because it's not just greedy corporations and parasitic bankers that are running this fake environmental scam. I think it must go even higher. When you think about it, it would make sense. If there are indeed terraformers of the Earth, higher intelligences, it would make sense for them to try and keep the world under control and massively depopulate it at this period in its history. But in reality, the parasites are not actually from another planet. They are amongst us. That's the main point. The UN programme, which every country signed up for, which is to control, manage all resources and reduce world population, well, I'm here to tell you, it's not aliens. When the climate change BS fails, maybe a fake alien invasion will be a lot more entertaining, though, than virtue signalling clones gluing themselves to roads and making endless false statements about the weather. A global cooperation based on deception and with a malevolent agenda appears to be in place, but also appearing as universal brotherhood, as with the visitors in V. This could have been a documentary, in actual fact, as to how the world is being run. It certainly was the blueprint for David Icke's early books. The divide and rule created by the visitors is exactly the same type of manipulation as the communitarian steering of the present moment. The real thing is Agenda 2030. The control, management and rationing of all resources under a corporate structure which operates in every country under treaties and international law and agreements with the UN goals. Those are the Sustainable Development Goals, of course. As a kind of bit of a side issue from that, I'm going to go into a really funny paper which was produced by the House of Lords, and it's available on Hansard. First of all, I'm going to have a very short break. Welcome back. That was The Return of Sovereignty from the soundtrack of The Heretics of London, the Smithfield Martyrs. And if you haven't downloaded it, please do. You'll learn a lot from that. It took a long time to put that together. It's a historical documentary of what happened in the 1500s. And I'm going to be working on more documentaries. Indeed, I am in the future. And I do depend on the listeners to support the work, because we are completely independent and ostracised. So do think about that. It's a lot of work putting out the sheer amount of information on Windows on the world. But I'm going to get now into this House of Lords Hansard document. You can find it on Hansard, and it was on June 30th, 2021, and it's titled Unidentified Flying Objects, and it was questions in the House of Lords. And Lord Sarfraz started the conversation, and he said to ask Her Majesty's government what assessment they have made of the report by the United States Office of the Director of Naval Intelligence preliminary assessment. Okay, so it says unidentified aerial phenomenon, published on 25th of June, and what data they hold on unidentified flying object sightings in the United Kingdom. Now, this is interesting because I know for a fact that military pilots and indeed commercial pilots have a log of any UFOs, unidentified or anomalous things that they see, and they're all logged. So every single sighting is logged by the pilot. That's a fact. So it says here, this is the Minister of State, Ministry of Defence, Baroness Goldie, Conservative. My Lords, the Ministry of Defence notes the content of the report. The department holds no reports on unidentified aerial phenomena, but constantly monitors UK airspace to identify and respond to any credible threat to its integrity, and is confident in the existing measures in place to protect it. I mean, this is just typical of the waffle you'd get from the Ministry of Defence, as if they would have any defence against an alien invasion if that were to happen. And of course, they lie through their teeth, saying the department holds no reports on unidentified aerial phenomenon when it's got hundreds of thousands of them. That's just a fact. It's utter BS. And ever since the Foo Fighters were seen following bombers during the Second World War, the MOD makes sure every incident is reported. Whether this is available to the public, of course, is quite another matter. So Lord Sarfraz, Conservative, continues, My Lords, for decades, people who have been concerned with UFOs have been dismissed as fantasists. But now the US Director of National Intelligence, who oversees 17 intelligence agencies, has published a report saying that the data on UFOs is inconclusive. Well, that's a typical MOD answer. It's inconclusive. In other words, well, we're not saying if it's real or if it isn't. It's a bit like when they invented 7-7 Brigade as a psychological operation on the British public and were asked by an army magazine, is this a psychological operation on the British public? And the army spokesman said, well, no, and yes. It's always inconclusive, and that's the point. The report offers several possible explanations, it says, and does not rule out that these could be military aircraft with very advanced capabilities or even extraterrestrial phenomenon, says Lord Sarfraz. Either way, can the Minister reassure members of the public that the Ministry of Defence takes reports of unidentified flying objects in our airspace very seriously? Will she consider publishing a detailed assessment of the data that we hold? Back to Baroness Goldie. The MOD deals with actual threats which are substantiated by evidence. The government continue to take any potential threat to the UK seriously. The Integrated Review and the Defence Command paper published in March set out the MOD's assessment of the threats we face and how we will meet them. I mean, they have to employ these almost articulate wafflers as spokespeople, and they never actually, of course, say anything. Avoiding the issue seems to be the preoccupation of the Earthlings. A straight-talking alien could floor them any day of the week in either the House of Commons or the House of Lords. Now, let's get back to this because it's quite funny. This is Viscount Ridley, Conservative. My Lords, unidentified does not mean suspicious. Does the Minister recognise that the US report referred to says that there is no clear indication that there is any non-terrestrial explanation for the 144 sightings that it specifies. The idea that in an era of mobile phones, cameras, drones and frequent travel, there could possibly be alien spaceships whizzing about undetected in our atmosphere on a regular basis is not very plausible. Well, I think he's kind of missed the point here, hasn't he? Because these things defy what is known on Earth as gravity, and they seem to be able to appear and disappear at will. So the way we actually observe things is limited by the way we are made to see them. But of course, being the way they are, these people, and probably being very establishment and having been mentored and to have been led to believe in their own self-importance from a very young age, they can't possibly believe that there's anything outside their understanding, of course. He says it is much more likely that these blurred images have boring explanations. Does my noble friend agree? Baroness Goldie. The important point on which I wish to reassure your lordships is that the UK air defence community detects and monitors all flying air systems 24 hours a day to provide an identified air picture as part of the UK's national security posture and our commitment to the integrity of NATO airspace. That is supported by Typhoon aircraft at RAF Lossiemouth and RAF Coningsby, which are held at high readiness to intercept any threat to UK airspace. She keeps on going on saying the same bloody thing over and over again. It's quite amusing. This is Lord Brown of Ladyton, and he's Labour. My lords, in 2008 the MOD began the process of releasing all its UFO files. In 2009, Sir Bob Ainsworth, the Secretary of State, accepted the advice that in more than 50 years no UFO sighting has indicated the existence of any military threat to the UK. There is no defence benefit in recording, collating, analysing or investigating UFO sightings. The level of resources devoted to this task is diverting staff from more valuable defence-related activities. And basically, Baroness Goldie comes back and says, I simply say to the noble lord that I seek to reassure him that, as I have indicated, we deal with actual threats substantiated by evidence. He is quite right about the closure of the UFO desk in 2009, however. I can confirm that the department holds no reports on unidentified aerial phenomena and that all relevant material created and held by the UFO desk has been passed to the National Archives. It goes on. And she just keeps repeating the same thing, whatever question she is given. It goes on for quite some time. In the end, she says, I refer the noble baron to my previous answers. The short response is, we take it very seriously in relation to addressing threats where those threats are identifiable and can be substantiated. So she just repeats the same thing on autopilot all the way through, whatever anyone says. It's very, very funny. And then this kind of finishes it off. Baroness Gardner of Parkes, Conservative. My lords, is the Minister aware of the role that one of the largest single-dish telescopes in the Southern Hemisphere in Parkes, New South Wales, the place of my birth, played in transmitting the TV footage of the of the Apollo 11 moon landings? And so this person is talking about how the Apollo landings were actually communicated. They were filmed off a television screen and beamed around the world. They weren't actually done from a source. They were actually filmed off a television screen. That's a bit of useless information there. But if we start going into the whole Apollo thing, we'll be here all night. And the best documentary which debunks the whole thing is called What Happened on the Moon. And they take apart the whole thing from the beginning with the photographs to the technology to what they said and to what was available at the time and what did and didn't happen and why it was shot in a studio. But basically, yes, that was quite an interesting exchange that I found on Hansard, and it's almost comedic in the responses, but it really is a good indicator of how the MOD deal with these things in this ambiguous and dismissive manner. It's all very amusing, of course, but the advances in military technology are definitely not shared with the public. Now, for instance, this is something that isn't that old, but it's something that I can actually substantiate because it was about the stealth bomber, the stealth fighter, these triangular-shaped planes. the flat triangular aircraft, which is undetectable by radar, I think, and can be cloaked. This was actually around in about 1971. So the technology was definitely developed in the 60s or the 50s. I met someone who was on a small US Air Force base in the Caribbean. He'd bought some land actually off the Vatican. It was someone I met, had a fascinating story. And next to this land, he said there was one of those stealth bombers, those triangular, very thin aircraft. And that was in the early 70s. And when I later researched this, I found another source saying exactly the same thing, that the serial number of a stealth fighter showed its original manufacture in the early 1970s. And of course, the first official test flight of the stealth fighter was in 1989. We didn't start to hear about those until the 1990s. So the connection between abduction, we're going to talk about that now, the connection between abduction and contactee experiences with UFOs, it's actually very tenuous, and they seem to be entirely unconnected except in the minds of the abductees. John Keel, who wrote This Mysterious Planet, I think he wrote, it was a book of anomalous findings. It was a bit like the stuff that Charles Fort used to put out. And he wrote a book called Operation Trojan Horse, and it explains the now familiar abductee-contactee story. His analysis was that contactees often find themselves suddenly miles from home without knowing how they got there. They either have induced amnesia, wiping out all memory of the trip, or they were taken over by some means and made the trip in a blacked out state. Should they encounter a friend on the way, the friend would probably note that their eyes seemed glassy and their behaviour seemed peculiar. But if the friend spoke to them, he might receive a curt reply. In the language of the contactees, this process is called being used. Well, it's interesting actually, because I have known two people at least who this has happened to, but they did not connect it with alien abduction. They had amnesia, which completely wiped their memory. They could be found wandering miles from home and had no idea how they'd got there, because it could have been a form of epilepsy. And there's a very mild form of epilepsy which actually causes this. A friend of mine had it, and she would actually wander off with a very glazed state, and it would take her a very long time to come back from wherever she was within her consciousness. And often she would have visions. So this is not necessarily connected to the abductee experience. He says, I have known silent contactees to disappear from their homes for long periods, and when they return, they had little or no recollection of where they have been. Of course, that doesn't really even tie to the whole phenomenon. As I said, these experiences are not that uncommon. But this has, of course, become the familiar template. And from the first contact story of Betty and Barney Hill, that was in 1961, which became the first big abductee story. There are now masses of abductees. It often verges on comedy. Betty was found to believe that street lights were UFOs, and her analysis of what was real and what wasn't was very, very suspect, to say the least. And she was actually booed off at one of her presentations when she was showing all these slides of blurred things that she'd seen in the sky. And ironically, she wrote a book called UFOs, A Common Sense Approach. It was later believed that both Betty and Barney had been influenced by a show called the Bolero Shield from the TV series The Outer Limits, which featured aliens with wraparound eyes. These people said they were abducted. They were driving on a vacation, and they were suddenly abducted by aliens. A film was made about it, I think in 1975. But this was later to be the familiar grey alien look. And this show had been broadcast about 10 days before the Hills had their abduction experience, which is quite interesting. So it was believed that they were kind of influenced to base their experience on this show, The Outer Limits, and the particular episode was called the Bolero Shield. Their story became a movie, so it was also allowed, of course, to become part of UFO folklore. Their story of abduction to Zeta Reticuli, they even actually identified where they'd been taken to, is a good example of the dangers of regression hypnosis, because that's when they actually started to remember it. And this is almost comedic, because people get put into these states, and of course these people who hypnotise them and put them into a trance are actually implanting this idea that they've been abducted. That of course, is the main problem with this sort of testimony, because it's kind of auto-suggestion. And of course, it's all part of popular culture now. So the alien abductee thing is so common that people would say, yes, I got abducted by aliens. It's as common as any other phenomenon that they could possibly make up or be part of. So the influence of sci-fi films has helped to shape the UFO abductee story. The experience the ones I've looked into do not indicate, though, that these people have been abducted and taken aboard spacecraft. They believe this because it has become a popular phenomenon, and the experiences are then attached to this story. The brainwashing actually seems to come from TV. The essence of these stories really seems to start with some kind of consciousness shift, as in the beginning of an out-of-body experience which cannot be understood by the experiencer or remembered with any clarity. Therefore, the alien story is attached, and these stories do seem to have a template. These experiences also include being forced down in bed and smothered. These things to me seem more like demonic attacks than extraterrestrial, but extraterrestrial, of course, as in other dimensional. And how do we know that aliens are not demons or demons are not aliens? We just don't know that. But it's much more prevalent in history that these things and these lights in the sky were demons, and these were demonic occurrences. The essence of these stories, it seems to start with consciousness shifts, and then these experiences have been smothered and then pulled out of their bodies, which is an out-of-body experience. Learning to be an observer, though, during these experiences can help anyone to stay free of this type of interference by entities. But basically aligning them with alien abduction is not at all helpful, because it just increases the fear, because obviously you're not in control of that. Indeed, UFOs have always been seen, but as I said, were connected to demonic entities, especially in the Middle Ages. But the story of abduction is most often being taken aboard a very clinical spaceship. The aliens are unemotional, cold and aloof. They conduct painful experiments and operations. They sometimes implant things into the abductee. The abductee then gets memories of the event, and there is missing time. And this missing time, in a lot of the cases, is often quite short. It's between 1 to 3 hours. That's actually been reported as the average. Well, I've listened to and I've met some of these individuals. Some are out-and-out fantasists and attention seekers. Others have had anomalous experiences but cannot comprehend what has happened, and have often been influenced by the abductee stories and aligned their experiences with these stories. The most interesting one I actually met was an ex-soldier, and he was very genuine, and it is clear he was trying to make sense of what had happened to him. He definitely suffered some strange experiences, and I believe, like he does, that he was the subject of military experimentation with drugs which were being developed to make combat troops controllable and better equipped as killing machines. And of course then we go into the next step of the super soldier and all this stuff, where we know that this has actually been worked on. Of course it would obviously be worked on, but then we get these people calling themselves super soldiers. And there was one particular, I can't remember his name, but he was passed around the UFO conspiracy circuit, and he was about as credible as, what could you say? You could say he was as credible as some of the people who were involved in the 2013 documentary Confessions of an Alien Abductee, including one who said she got abducted every time she walked towards McDonald's. That's what I was trying to remember, that show. But this person I met was indeed, though, a targeted individual. He did not want to talk about the experiences except to try to make sense of them. It included a download of information which was way outside his previous knowledge, and it all started on a military manoeuvre in a remote area where they set up an overnight camp. And I believe he was the subject of illegal experimentation. So this could be a very good reason why the MOD does put out this blanket of misinformation around UFOs. It's to keep the public completely in the dark and guessing about what's really going on. And of course, once you sign up to the Ministry of Defence through the Army, you are their property. The MOD can make anything disappear and cover anything up, and that is, after all, their role in national security. It's the securitisation of the financial well-being of the country. And of course, as the ex-UFO, ex-MOD gatekeeper Nick Pope used to say, I can tell you what didn't happen, but I can't tell you what did happen. Classic MOD piece of misinformation and logical fallacy there. The most interesting thing is what they are covering up. And this is the only thing that is ever missing from this subject. I actually reported on this paper by Martin Cannon called The Controllers. You can download it on the free books page at Windows on the World. And apart from some assumptions in there which I don't really agree with, there's some good information. And he put forward the idea that this false memory syndrome, i.e. the abduction experience, is implanted in the minds of those who have been the subject of experimentation. And there is some mileage in this. Because the broad umbrella term which everyone in the conspiracy circus uses, MK Ultra, was in fact a massive umbrella program for so many different offshoots, and he goes into some of those in that paper, The Controllers. It was actually an umbrella for multiple projects, MK Ultra. It wasn't just one thing. So there is actually nothing very mysterious, though, about controlling minds. I mean, think about it. Stage hypnotists do it to anyone who is susceptible to hypnosis. So these people will go round to theatres and they will openly hypnotise the whole audience into doing the most stupid things on the stage. And I used to know a very influential stage hypnotist, and he was actually an agent for a while. He was getting me some gigs in places like the Canary Islands, but he actually taught Paul McKenna, and he had some very interesting history, and he had been caught out trying to hypnotise people for his own ends, shall we say. But repetitive behaviour patterns and unconscious behaviour is rife among the earthlings. The mystery is why they are so easily and willingly hypnotised. So it appears that all the misdirection around the UFO field is deliberate distraction. And I found another article going back to 2008, January the 6th, 2008, theguardian.com, space exploration and the military. It was saying they were going to release Whitehall's full back catalogue of UFO investigations after the Directorate of Airspace Policy, the government agency responsible for filtering sensitive reports, gave its permission to publish the biggest single release of documents in MOD history. And I think this is the ongoing thing, isn't it? It's like a complete energy harvest of, is it disclosure or is it not? And now it says the government fears a repeat of the unprecedented demand and the website crash experienced by the French National Space Agency in March when it released its own UFO files. This is going back to 2008. So, of course, this UFO thing is also a great cover for a distraction. So they can bring in the UFO stories if they want to bury more important stuff. So it's always useful for that, of course. And it says government IT experts are believed to have drawn up contingency plans to avoid a repeat scenario when Britain's dossiers are finally made public. This was such a long time ago. But when I was actually looking for relevant information, a lot of it was from years ago. But the big one among the first tranche of UK cases, says this article, will be the official government files into the famous Rendlesham Forest incident, dubbed Britain's Roswell, after the US incident, of course, when a flying saucer is said to have crash landed in New Mexico. That's the Roswell incident. But that was interesting, actually, because a lot of the witnesses of the Roswell incident, the ones who were still alive, were in a documentary years ago, and they were very credible. And of course, that was a cover-up. That was definitely a cover-up, and that's really what started the whole thing off. But the Rendlesham Forest one was quite similar because the spacecraft had these very strange markings and symbols on it, allegedly. On a foggy night in 1980, several witnesses reported a UFO apparently landing in Rendlesham Forest, Suffolk. Statements claimed the craft was covered in markings similar to Egyptian hieroglyphs and aliens emerged from it. Interestingly, a man later confessed to having staged the incident as a hoax. Now, this is definitely a cover-up because the military who were there reported at the time that they actually lost control of their missiles, and the incident left markings in the earth, damage to trees where they'd been burned. And I think it was Larry Warren, the military policeman who was on duty, never changed his story, but General Holt, who was originally one of the people in charge of this investigation, he kind of tried later, I think, to discredit what Warren had said. It's a long time since I've read the book on it, but it was quite interesting. But the recollections of Larry Warren, the RF policeman, were challenged by Holt, but Warren has stuck to his story and never wavered. And he did appear to me to be an honest witness. See what you think, but I think that fella is telling the truth. But yes, as MOD gatekeeper and dispenser of pointless sound bites, Nick Pope says in his book on the subject of the Rendlesham Forest, he is no closer to an answer on what happened. And of course, he refuses to offer a definitive theory. Another distracting disappointment, but that's often the case with MOD employees, as we know. But there's also the UK's UFO files, and the disclosures, it says, about these UK files that we've been talking about are more likely to blame military activities such as missile launches, testing of prototype aircraft and other activities during the Cold War. So, of course, we're never allowed to get to the bottom of this subject. So we have to ask ourselves why it's being gatekept and managed and controlled in this way. Of course, they can say it's national security. But David Clarke, a lecturer in journalism at Sheffield Hallam University and author of Flying Saucerers, a social history of ufology. I like that, Flying Saucerers, that's good, that. He says something was definitely going on. But really, these files show that the government did not know either. This release will be a source of disappointment or vindication for some and embarrassment for others. Again, here we have the problem. None of these people know anything, so they just carry on making pointless statements, a bit like Baroness Goldie in the House of Lords. But apparently the government was considering destroying the 24 files created by DI55 or D155. This is a disclosure project because they were contaminated by asbestos. Not only were the UFO records polluted, but a total of 63,000 files, estimated at between 6 to 12 million pages, most of them classified as secret, were facing the same fate. And having admitted the existence of the problem, the MOD opted to instigate a £3 million project to digitally scan the files before they were destroyed. Scanning of the 24 contaminated UFO files owned by DI55 was completed last year. This was in 2008, although it is understood that names of officials in the reports will be removed. Although the government remains reticent, its intelligent work on UFOs, reticent to discuss it, that is, it is known that DI55, I think it's DI55, it's not D155, has been hot on the trail of flying saucers since the 60s. Experts admit that they work closely with the security services, MI5, MI6 and GCHQ to collect and assess evidence of potential threats to Britain. And this is, of course, where it gets gatekept into national security. So it's completely within their remit to make up stories, to program individuals and give them a cover story, an implanted cover story of being abducted if they are experimented on by the Ministry of Defence or any other agency. So this alien abductee thing may just be implanted by the state. And that is what Martin Cannon gets to in his paper, The Controllers, which is actually quite worth a read. You can download that, as I say, on the free books page at Windows on the World. So it does appear that the whole alien agenda is woven into the counterintelligence misdirection by government. It provides also a useful tool to unite the world against an outside existential threat with little need for evidence. It is an ideal steering device for controlling not only the minds, but locking down the world over an invisible threat. The amount of rubbish talked on the subject, though, covers up more sinister aspects of what the alien agenda is used for. Implanting false memories or leading subjects to believe they have been abducted is a cover story which not only makes the victim look unhinged in the eyes of the masses, but also prevents any real investigation into what actually was done to them. My experience with the UFO field, though, is that there are many who are not only unhinged, but dangerously deluded and even malevolent, who are working to put out misinformation and to destroy people's lives in this field. There's a very serious and sinister side to it. This makes me think some of these people may well be under mind control of some kind themselves. And one thing that is overriding is the sinister activities that surround this subject. Suicides. I know people who've had suicides around them because of this phenomenon or connected to it. Attacks, surveillance, and in some cases very strange incidents which are most definitely supernatural. They are definitely unexplainable, I can say that. But I'm glad I have contacts in this field, but sifting through the illusion can be difficult, if not completely impossible, as there are so many possibilities for false memory and outside influences in the stories of those who try and make sense of what are to them unexplainable experiences. What I do know, I know this for a fact, is there is a cabal of people, probably linked to the intelligence community, who are monitoring people in this field. I know this because I spoke alongside some UFO and contactee speakers at an event, and there was a very overt masquerading as covert surveillance of the people involved. There were people surveilling the attendees of the conference. There were cars parked up monitoring who was going in and out of places where these speakers were staying. It was quite interesting as to why they would basically be so interested in what to the state could be viewed as just a bunch of cranks. Whether this is just genuine infiltration by government or agents implanting information into this field, however, is a worthy field of investigation. And of course, if we go back to the story of Candy Jones in the 1960s, it indicated a possible case of mind control. There's been more since, obviously, but she was one of the first ones, I think. Under hypnosis, Candy Jones related a lengthy, elaborate account of her being trained in a CIA mind control program at West Coast colleges and universities. Jones and her radio host husband, John Nebel, eventually recorded hundreds of hours of these hypnotic sessions where she said she had been under mind control. And of course, we've heard a lot about this since, when people suddenly break these altars that have been put in their mind, these obstacles, and their minds are petitioned, and the petitions break down, and they have these memories. But none of this, in my opinion, or in my research, reveals anything concrete. And that is the enigma and the whole problem with this area of research. There have been more so-called mind control slaves appearing to tell their stories, of course, ever since. And what this field is covering up with possible false memories and misdirection is actually more concerning than the actual cover story of the UFOs. The malevolent plans being propagated for Earth are actually originating on it. Whether this is with off-planetary help or control is, of course, an interesting question, and one which makes sense to look into. And I may do more shows on this in the future. I've never actually done a full show on this phenomenon and my view of it from the contacts that I've actually got in this field. It's quite interesting because I've stayed kind of on the outside looking in, and I find some of it quite interesting, and some of it is definitely being used to steer the public. Other more sinister aspects are that it can be used to make people become completely unhinged or even to commit suicide, and this may have something to do with knowledge that they may have. And I have circumstantial evidence of that from someone I knew quite a long time ago, and that story has since come out. But that was a very disturbing story. And that's one thing I would say about this. There doesn't seem to be much joy in it. The people who have these experiences do not have an experience which changes their life for the better. It's pretty much always detrimental. So, if you found that interesting, then send in information which you think may be of interest to me. I always appreciate getting stuff because the things that get sent into the show are so fascinating. People find papers and books that I just wouldn't have heard of. So all this helps to improve the archive at Windows on the World, and that's the whole point of this. This is a lifelong learning project which I'm sharing with you, the listener. So I hope you enjoyed that. And as a little outro, and on a much lighter note, I want to play you my comedy song, my music hall comedy song about alien abduction, Abduction at Junction 5. Thanks for all those who support the show. Thanks to the listeners. And do check out Odyssey, our Odyssey channel, and look out for the live streams. Yes, we do still do live streams on YouTube. We did a really good one the other day called The Solution. And isn't it ironic that people would rather listen to stuff that has no solution than a show called The Solution, which is the solution? So that may well have something to do with the endless distractions on planet Earth. Thanks a lot, everybody, for all your participation, and good night.
Flashing lights in the sky, is it those aliens? The universe, multiverse, other dimensions. Monday night, Junction 5 of the M25. A UFO hovered low, and I was taken inside. It was technologically advanced. I was telepathically entranced. They took my clothes, counted my toes, and flew into the sky. I could see the moon, Uranus too, and off to Nibiru. The aliens were small and grey, with big bug eyes. They scanned my mind for intelligent life, and they were quite surprised, 'cause I was really quite advanced. For an earthling in a trance. God blimey, it's like my fortune in here, airless. I hope you're not abducting me for medical experiments. Here, pull that down, you don't know where it's been. I was really quite advanced. For an earthling in a trance. On Tuesday night, I materialised back at Junction 5. Opens the door of my car, and I got inside. To my surprise, I was 3 feet tall, with big bug eyes. My feet won't reach the pedals now, and I'm still at Junction